and he put them in the trunk of the car where my mother couldn't see them. And we drove back to the city, back to Dublin where we lived. And when we got there, my father opened the trunk of the car and showed my mother, and she nearly died. Of course, she was like so mad with him. She was like, what are we going to do with the goats? Hello, welcome back to the Bleedin Truth. This is Sally McNally,
the Irish midwife, and I'm her daughter, Bridget. So welcome back. If you are a new listener, Sally is a midwife from Ventura, California, and she and I are doing this podcast to bring awareness to women's health around the world, and also just to spend more time together and share some of her incredible stories, because she has some really wild ones, some really good ones, and some really sad ones as well, from all of her years in the labor room and just personal stories from around the world.
So last week's episode was a little bit dark, and so we're going to lift the spirits a little bit here with some happier stories from growing up in Ireland.
Yeah, and still listener discretion is advised, because sometimes some of Sally's stories can be disturbing to some people. So
I'm so sorry about that.
also, before we get into the story today, if you didn't know already, you can ask Sally a question. We'll answer it here on the podcast. All right. So the first question that we have today is from Karina. How and where did you learn to tell stories, Sally?
Oh, thank you for that question. That's lovely. Well, I believe most Irish people are storytellers. We didn't always have a TV. I can remember when a TV was brought into our house. And before that, we used to literally sit around the fireplace and tell stories and listen to each other's stories. My father was a great storyteller, and I can remember when we did get the first TV. It was an old broken one, and he used to set it up on a dresser, and he'd fiddle with the buttons on the back of the TV, and he'd have us sitting there saying, "Can you see it now? Can you see it now?" And all these wavy lines uh, were on the TV, and eventually then a picture would form and we'd say, "We can see it, we can see it." But then, of course, it wouldn't last long. But it gave him a bit of an interest in fixing old TVs for a while. Yeah, but I think that telling stories, it's something very important. When I talk to my daughter Bridgie, she tells me that she remembers my stories from, when she was a little kid. And that's like,
Yeah.
it's so important, I think, that we tell our histories. I have an uncle who wrote his life story, and the stories that were in there helped to fill gaps in our own family's history that were so important, and helped us to understand our father, in a better way. But thinking about the TV, one of that first TV, it was up on this dresser that had a door on the front of the dresser. And I can remember as a little kid swinging on that door back and forth, swinging on it. But I must have been getting a little heavier, and I was swinging on the door this day, and the whole dresser came down, and the television went flying
Oh
over my
no.
head and smashed in 1,000 pieces on the ground. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm in such big trouble now. And my father came and he saw what happened, and he said, "Sally, come here." And he was doing like a little curly thing with his finger. And he brought me out to the back garden, and I thought, I'm going to get a whopping now. But instead, he gave me £1, which is money. It was like $2 at the time. And he said, "Thanks very much for breaking that bloody television." He said, he was so worried about one of my sisters. She was about to sit for her leaving certificate, and he was afraid she was watching too much TV and not studying enough. And she was very clever, and he really wanted her to do well. And now that the TV was broken, he felt more confident she'd study. And then he said, "Now don't let on that I wasn't mad about the TV." So when I went in, I had to pretend that, I was after getting, punishment. It was funny.
That's so funny. That's
But
wild.
thanks for the question about the stories, Karina. I think we're all a story our whole lives. All of us, we are all a story, and we should, tell our stories more.
Thank you, Karina, for that question. And if anybody else wants to ask Sally a question, either about her stories or midwife, yoga, anything like that, we'll make sure to put a link in the description below and you can ask her there and we'll answer it in the next podcast. So I guess that means it is story time. I know you said I do remember most of your stories. I think it's true. You tell them in such a way that you get so wrapped up into it, and you create that picture in someone's mind, and that's what is the memorable part, because I'm imagining you as a little girl in Ireland growing up, and with my grandparents, your
Yeah.
parents, and the five sisters and all of that, and I love hearing more about it. So
Thanks,
yeah.
Bridgie. I was going to talk about growing up in Catholic Ireland at the time, very Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
And our house was very, very Catholic. Both my parents were Eucharistic ministers. That means that eventually they got to a stage with their religion where they were handing out Holy Communion after Mass, or during the Mass. And also, my father used to lead the rosary at the church, and it was on a kind of like a little radio station as well, for people who couldn't make it to the church, who were like very sick or, in hospice. So he would lead the rosary from the church, and he was very proud of that. And the rosary was a big deal in our house growing up. We all had rosary beads. I remember I had a pair of rosary beads that Pope John Paul gave me when he came to Ireland. I was lucky that he handed me these rosary beads. My parents used to make us kneel down on the floor every night and say the rosary. And it was a long prayer, Hail Mary, Holy Mary, Hail Mary, Holy Mary. And we'd do this prayer, and it took like 20 minutes, maybe 15, 20 minutes to get through the whole thing. And we'd be kneeling on the ground, and sometimes we'd kneel over chairs or just kneel there. And I'm sure we looked like, if it was over here, we'd look like kind of a cult, I guess, but not really. Because I'm sure people still pray like that here as well. And it was very humbling at the end of the day to kneel down and pray. But my sister Kathleen was always a great source of enjoyment and frivolity, and she made me laugh so much throughout my life. But I can remember a few times she'd be across the room making faces at me. And we'd be Hail Mary, Holy Mary, Hail Mary, Holy Mary. But then if I'd see her, she'd be sticking her tongue out at me or something, or making weird faces. And then I'd get caught laughing and get slapped. Yeah, that was our Catholic.
That's really funny, actually. I remember in Ireland when I was little visiting your family.
Yeah.
I wasn't raised religious at all, but your mom, my grandma, would come into my room at night before bed and have me pray with her, and I had no idea what
Yeah.
was going on. I, I just felt like I had to go along with it, so
Oh,
I was like, just pretend, and I'd like mumble, and I just had no idea what was going on.
so cute.
I just didn't want her to be sad.
And she was so sweet. My mother was so sweet and
Yeah, she
such a
was.
religious woman. And she truly had such great faith in her religion and God. And so she was beautiful. And the same with my father. They used to go to Mass, so much, sometimes every day.
Wow.
Yeah. And of course, they wanted us to be, good Catholics as well. And Lent would come, and we would say, we're going to Mass, we're going to Mass. And of course, sometimes we didn't go to Mass, we'd go and meet our friends. And my poor father'd get so mad with us when we became teenagers, we were, oh yeah, we're going to Mass. And then he'd find, no, we weren't in the church, and where could we be? And sometimes we'd be with Tommy Cooney, and Tommy Cooney was this tall, handsome young fella, and I think he dated like four of us, four out of the six of us, and so he caused great strife in my father's mind. Um, where is she? Where is she? And somebody'd say she's with Tommy Cooney, and oh my God, my father would. I can remember once we were all walking along with Tommy Cooney. Uh, and here comes my father with his walking cane, walking nice and fast.
Oh,
And Tommy Cooney ran the opposite direction. Oh, Tommy Cooney.
that's funny.
Yeah, I think he taught a few of us how to kiss.
Oh my god. You included?
And me included.
Oh, great. So how about growing up? I know you had some interesting pets as a young girl.
Oh, yes. Well, yes, we were allowed to have pets in our house because we all loved animals. So spaying and neutering was not uh, mandatory in Ireland. So at one stage, I remember we landed with like a bunch of pups and
Oh
kittens
wow.
at the same time.
Wow.
So it was great fun. Everybody had a baby to cuddle. It was so wonderful. We were so happy with all the baby animals. And we'd bring our friends home from school, and there'd be a big line of kids coming down to cuddle the animals, in the back garden. It was like a petting zoo at one stage.
Oh.
But we had relatives that were in the country. The country is like, with farms, wonderful cousins and uncles and aunts. And we'd go and visit them. And this time we went to visit, and one of my uncles, we were walking and through the farm, and he said, "Oh yes, there's some baby goats there. We're going to have to put them down because we don't want any more goats." And I asked my father, "What does that mean?" And my father said, "Well, he's probably going to kill them and eat them." And I was like horrified. Oh my God, the goats were so cute. The goats were like,
Oh.
and jumping around. And so I said, "Please, please, please." And my other sisters, we were like asking my father, "Please don't let it happen. Don't let it happen." My father was a big
Oh.
softy. And so he got the two goats and he tied their legs together, all four legs. I can remember all four legs tied
Oh.
together. And he put them in the trunk of the car where my mother couldn't see them. And we drove back to the city, back to Dublin where we lived. And when we got there, my father opened the trunk of the car and showed my mother, and she nearly died. Of course, she was like so mad with him. She was like, "What are we going to do with the goats?" And he said, "I couldn't let them, be killed." The girls were so upset.
Oh.
Um, so we took the goats out and we put them in our back garden. We had this lovely back garden. It was a big, long garden, and there was a big space for vegetables, and there was hedges and flowers and roses, and it was such a beautiful place. Both my mother and father loved to garden, and they loved feeding us. With the fresh vegetables from the garden. And we had a little chicken pen down in a chicken house. And it was a really fun place. But I can remember that garden, when we moved into the house, I was like about 5 or 6. It was just like a stony mess. And my father built little sheds that became like little houses, and he had us all picking all the stones out of the soil. We'd go out every weekend, we'd pick the stones out of the soil
Wow.
and make a pathway. All those stones became a pathway down the middle of the garden.
Wow.
Yeah, but these goats, anyway, they were so cute, and they were starting to grow little horns. We made leashes for them out of these ropes, and we'd walk our goats down the street just like walking your dog, right? We looked so weird, and some of the kids from Dublin, they'd be like, "What kind of a dog's that?" And we'd be like, "That's a goat." Like as if it was like, "What, don't you know anything? It's a goat." But our goats were so cute. But of course, in the garden, they'd eat everything. They were eating the hedges, they were
Oh,
eating the
yeah.
vegetables, and they were a big nuisance. And my mother was getting very mad with the goats, and she said, "We can't keep the goats." And my poor father, he decided, well, he was going to kill one of the goats, right? Make a food out of the goat. But we didn't know any of this. Um, but one day we were sitting down to our dinner, and we were like
Oh,
eating
no.
this strange meat that I never tasted before. And this actually started my being a vegetarian. Because I'm eating this meat and it's kind of chewy and it's not really tasty. I wouldn't call it tasty because, we maybe weren't used to cooking goats. My mother was a chef, that was her job, and she was like, she could turn anything into a meal. But I remember chewing this and looking around the table, and one of my sisters was like really sad and she looked like she was crying. And then it dawned on me, this isn't right. And I stopped eating and I said, this is not right. And I was very young. And so I remember feeling very sad about that. And my father, he actually cried telling us about it. And he said he felt so guilty. He said he tried to kill the goat with his own hands. And it was really difficult because the goat wouldn't die. And it took him
Oh,
ages to kill the goat. And he said it was the worst thing he ever did. And he just had so much remorse over killing the wee goat. But that was the first goat. And then the second goat, of course, it was eating all the wrong things and it got sick. So we did not eat that one. But my father tried to make it all right in our heads and in our hearts. And he had the second goat stuffed by a taxidermist. Um, and I remembered the story. The taxidermist had to send away to America to get the eyes for the goats because he had to get special like glass eyes for the goat. But that goat, he was just a little goat, got put on a little grassy patch and stood on our piano for the rest of our days there. And people would come to the house and they'd look and they'd say, "Is that a goat on your piano?" And we'd be like, "Yeah, that's a goat." Like as if it's normal, there's a goat on our piano.
it's so funny. That I also have my own story about too.
Yes, tell us, Bridgie.
I remember, so you had told me about the goat when I was younger, but every time I'd gone to Ireland, there wasn't a goat. Uh, the stuffed one, we never saw it. But one of the last times I went, someone was like, Bridget, you should go clean out the attic and see, what photos and stuff you can find up there. And I was like, okay. And I remember climbing up the ladder to get up into the attic, and it's all dark. There's not a whole lot. And I got mostly up there and I turned on the light, and right in front of me is this goat in the attic staring at me with those little glass eyes.
That's hilarious.
And I was like, oh, wow, it's still there.
So that's where it went.
Yeah.
That's funny.
I don't know where it is now, but
I think one of my sisters has it.
oh man, we'll have to find a photo. Do you know how old you were when you had the goat?
Probably 7 or 8. I'm
Wow.
thinking very young, yes. Um, but that sure was fun, the little goat. But my mother, so that was one way that helped me become a vegetarian. And then
Yeah.
my mother, she kind of helped me a wee bit too, unknowingly. Um, she wanted us all to be very handy with, how to prepare meals, vegetables, and then how to prepare meat. She used to teach us all how to kill the chicken and clean the chicken. So I can remember once she was teaching me how to kill a chicken, and it was very hard because I really liked the little animals. And she was great at it. She would take the head of the chicken in one hand and the body in the other, and she would just like
Oh.
pull the head down and just snap its neck, bap, just like a little snap. And she'd do it over her knee, and she was great because she had, learnt this as a child herself growing up in the country. Um, and then she handed me a live chicken. She said, "Now you do it." And I tried to do it, and then I couldn't bring myself to do it. So instead, I was like pulling on the poor chicken's neck, and the chicken's neck was getting longer and longer. And I was like, she was like, "Snap it, snap it." But the neck seemed to be like elastic, and it was like getting longer and longer. And the poor chicken, it was not good. So my mother had to finish the job there. But then, anyway, she would teach us to get the chicken and dump the chicken into like hot water once it was dead. And then that would help to release the feathers. And you would just pull the feathers down and keep your hand going real fast. And they would just come like falling out really quickly.
Wow.
And then you would have to put your hand up the bottom of the chicken and pull out all the intestines and organs. And that was, really hard because the chicken was still warm just after being alive a few minutes later. And she used to say the quicker you do it, the quicker it'll be done, and the fresher then the meat. But it didn't sit well with me, you
Yeah.
know. But she was great. She was a great teacher, and she was a fabulous cook. That chicken would taste, so good by the time she was done with it. But sometimes our relatives down the country, when we'd go to visit, they would give us, live turkey for the Christmas dinner or live chickens to bring back. And then we'd prepare it ourselves when we'd get
Wow.
home.
So at what point did you actually go vegetarian?
Well, it was a bit later when I started doing yoga. I had this yoga teacher, and he said, "Stop eating meat for 30 days. Don't eat any meat products for 30 days, and then we're all going to go out and have a steak dinner." And that's what we did. We didn't eat any meat, and then we were to record how we felt different after eating the meat. And we all had the same reaction. We were all sluggish and tired and felt heavy and constipated. And it was like a different feeling to the lightness of being that us vegetarians use. But
Yeah.
then also, I helped myself become a vegetarian because at one stage, I had a little house in Ireland that was in the country. And at the time, I was kind of interested in shooting and guns. I
Really?
know, I know, I know. I'm
What?
kind of ashamed of this part of my life. Um, I had a
What?
Somebody gave me a single barrel shotgun, and the idea was if you had the single shot, um, you would take that shot more carefully and not miss your target, right? My
Uh-oh.
targets were the poor defenseless bunnies running in the fields.
Wow.
Yeah, I know, I'm so sad about it. I, that's why I've rescued
That's
bunnies. I
yeah,
have
now she has three bunnies or two
two
bunnies
now.
now in the backyard, and they're free, and they live and they have their little tunnels wherever
Yes.
they desire.
Yes, they live their best life. Correct my karma.
I see now.
But I can remember with my single shot, aiming so carefully, with the intention of killing the small animal, and so I became a pretty good shot, and I did kill a few bunnies with that. Yeah, but I felt bad doing it. I can remember the last one. I can remember he looked at me and I looked at him, and then I killed him, and that's so mean. I'm so sorry, little bunny. But I remember skinning them
Oh
and
wow.
curing the skins as best I could, and eating the meat, even though it wasn't good. And I wasn't a good cook. But I did try to like do the right thing by the bunny, but I don't know what was going on in my mind. And I remember one of my sisters, Ronnie, she said to me, "What are you doing? Why would you want to do that?" And that really stuck with me, and I couldn't do it anymore once somebody called me on it because I didn't need to do that. Yeah, but now I have these beautiful little free bunnies in the garden, and they're like, "Hey," when I go out, they're like, "Hey, how are you?" And I get lots of eye contact and lots of, love with.
They'll come eat out of your hand instead.
Yes.
So cute.
But yeah, it's very interesting to think about all of the ways that life will lead you into a path. Like I didn't actually become vegetarian until I was well into my late 20s, 30s maybe. Yeah.
Wow.
And I don't have anything against anybody eating meat. They'll get there too. But growing up in Ireland was a great place to grow up. So much fun, so interesting. Like my father was a taxi driver in the city, and he used to work nights because there was more work. He'd bring people from the airport, he'd pick up people from the city, coming out of the nightclubs and the pubs and stuff. Ireland's known for its busy nightlife. So that's when his day would start.
Yeah.
And he was so wonderful, such a great man. It's so honest and wonderful. I can remember him priding himself in his honesty
And his jokes.
and his jokes. Yeah, so hilarious. But like if somebody gave him too much change in the shop, like even if it was a penny, he'd go back in and he'd say, "Oh, you gave me the wrong change," and he'd give it back to them. That's the how he was. But
Yeah.
sometimes we'd wake up in the middle of the night and he'd be coming in with a bunch of Americans because they had come in too late and something had happened with their hotel or something went wrong and they had nowhere to stay. And my mother would sometimes let him, do a bed and breakfast where they could have
Oh, wow.
bed and then breakfast, but it was maybe one of our beds. So we'd have to pile in a few of us, like four, into one bed, and the Americans would get the bed. And then when they'd wake up in the morning, then of course they'd get the Irish breakfast.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. And it was great fun. We made lots of friends.
I love that about Irish people. They're so welcoming.
Yeah, so we made lots of friends that way, and it gave us like ideas of other parts of the world. And they weren't all Americans, of course, they were from different parts of the world. But Americans always stuck in my head because they were so interesting. And I remember St. Patrick's Day in Ireland was very religious day. We'd all get up and go to mass, and we'd wear our little shamrock on our jacket. And then after Mass, we'd sometimes go into the city centre to see the parade. And of course, what we wanted to see were the Americans in the parade because they'd have these wonderful bands and people who had come from America dressed all in green and wearing green tights. The green tights were always amazing to us. But also, Americans helped us, see our identity, that they would come and everything was so charming and so quaint and so lovely that it kind of like showed us like how wonderful our country really is. And it is a place to go and visit. If you've never been to Ireland, go and visit. You'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll see beautiful scenery and meet the best people, salt of the earth. Absolutely wonderful people. But don't, if you're a young woman, don't let those men talk poetry to you. If they start with the poetry, get out of there quick.
Isn't that what happened to you?
That's what happened to me. They're so romantic and they're so captivating. And of course, poetry in Ireland's a big thing. That's another form of storytelling and
Oh,
weaving
totally.
of words and form of hypnosis, right? My own husband caught me with the poem too. He invited me to a poetry session. And yeah, that's another story there.
That'll be the next episode.
Thank you very much for coming and listening to some of our stories. Please come back again and tell your friends if you think anybody might be interested in listening to the Bleedin' Truth.
Yes, absolutely. Share it with everybody you know, and make sure to give Sally a like and subscribe if you're on YouTube, or a follow if you're on Apple and Spotify. And we will see you in the next one.
Thanks a million.
Thanks a million.